Welcome, everybody, to another episode of One Foot Down, a college fantasy football podcast on the Fantasy in Frames Network. I'm your host, Chris Battistel, and joining us back today in the fold is Mike Haase, coming back from sick leave. This is week 5, and we're going to get you ready with our plays and fades for the week. Let's get it popping, Mike.
Welcome, football fanatics, to the One Foot Down podcast on the Fantasy in Frames Network. Your gridiron guides, Chris and Mike, are geared up to lead you through the thrilling world of college fantasy football. Whether we're diving into Power 5 giants or uncovering hidden gems, brace yourselves for expert insights, analysis, and daring predictions. Stay in the game. Subscribe, rate, and review. This is your 2024 source for college fantasy football dominance. Let the fantasy frenzy begin.
All right, Mike, welcome back to the program. Week 5 is here. If you are a college fantasy football player, do not give up. If you're 0-4, if you're 2-2, if you're 1-3, do not lose hope. The college fantasy football season is shorter than the NFL fantasy football season, but there is a lot more opportunity to turn your ship around and right the path because of the vast pool of players at your disposal on waivers and through trades and other avenues that you can take in order to get yourself going. So with this week 5 important episode here on One Foot Down, that is our goal. We're going to give you a play and fade for each position heading into the week. We're going to talk about some players that you might be targeting, as well as recapping a little bit of week 4. But before we do that, Mike, how you holding up, man?
Holding up. You're right. You rode shotgun last week and did an amazing job from what I understand. There'd be no getting there, getting better, and can't believe almost mid-season we're talking for college. Almost mid-season.
Yeah, we are getting close. We are getting close. I believe there's only 14 weeks in the college fantasy football season. We are week 5. We are almost at the halfway point for the regular season for college fantasy.
Correct.
So week 5, week 6, week 7 are pivotal weeks to turn your season around. And you're going to do that. We're going to help you right your path and get you on the right footing towards a trophy. Mike, week 4 had some big output. We saw some players put up some big numbers for fantasy football. We saw some upsets for the college football landscape. One of the biggest ones was JMU just curb stomping the 3-0 North Carolina Tar Heels, dropping a 70 burger on them and just absolutely destroying them. What is your outlook for the Tar Heels going for the rest of the season? Do you see them making the CFP? Do you see them making the college football playoff?
We sure had hoped at the start of the year they were one of our teams, and I wonder if QB position now they're in injury a little bit, getting on to the third guy in line. Yeah. So yet he was throwing the ball pretty well and making numbers for our fantasy purposes. For us, it was good, 70, 50 or whatever it was. But in the grand scheme of things, to win games and to make the playoff, I think they're going to be in pretty tough. It's too bad because some of those offensive players on that team are juggernauts, a few of them at their position. One who I have, Hampton, and so it's great in fantasy. They're getting those points, but I don't think they'll edge their way into the playoff.
Yeah, especially they got to win the games that they're supposed to win. And they were supposed to win that one against JMU. They walked in double-digit favorites, and for them to get 70 dropped on them, 70. And it wasn't just like they scraped a win by. They dropped 70 on the Tar Heels this past weekend and just absolutely embarrassed them. Looking ahead at North Carolina's schedule, they got Duke, Pitt, Georgia Tech with their next 3 games. They got the bye. And then Virginia, Florida State. Florida State's been absolute dog shit. and then Wake Forest, Boston College, and NC State. So that back half of their schedule can get a little bit treacherous for their hopes making the college football playoff if they keep playing like they did against JMU. Another great game, Colorado, Baylor. Colorado's been the talk of the college football town. Rightfully so. They got some big names on there. Coach Sanders, his son Shador, throwing the rock, a quarterback. They came and pulled out a win against Baylor in OT. Mike, is this game Shador Sanders putting the stamp and solidifying his first round eval?
Yeah, I think he'll still have a lot to prove, obviously, in order to do that. But what I like about the game, no turnovers on his side, over 300 yards again, rushing one, I believe. So if he can have that, get consistency together with doing all of the phases, then we will see where he goes. But I kind of thought Baylor might beat them. I thought Baylor would be able to keep up with the consistency of what Colorado's been doing, kind of win, lose. I had in mind, I thought Baylor would have a bit of the advantage. So kudos to Colorado. But he's got a lot to prove still in every facet. I think he has to build. It's a builder for him over the next little while.
Yeah. Baylor just didn't get to. I mean, they got 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9 sacks. So they did.
Wow.
They did get some pressure on Shador, and Shador was a fade for me going into the week because of the fact that Baylor, through those first 3 weeks, wasn't able to put pressure on the quarterback, wasn't able to create that pressure on the quarterback. And you give a player like Shador Sanders time, and we've seen it time and time again, he's just going to pick apart your defense. And in this game, they were able to get to Shador Sanders, and he was still able to move the ball pretty good. I think him showing out, going in, having a win like that against a team like Baylor, showing that he can show poise, given the fact that, the not the Colorado State game, but the game versus Nebraska, where he left 2 minutes before the game was over, and everyone was questioning his character. For him to just go into these last 2 games, silence the doubters, pull out an overtime win against Baylor, I think was great for his fantasy stock outside of the tangibles. So these are the intangibles that you might not see on tape that are going to solidify Shador Sanders' value as a college pro. And then Navy beating Memphis. Navy just absolutely beating up on Memphis on the ground. The QB, Blake Horvath, was the number 1 overall fantasy producing quarterback in week 4, 192 passing yards, 2 passing TDs, 211 rushing yards, 4 rushing TDs, and he even had a reception, 62.58 fantasy points. Mike, man, did you start Horvath anywhere? Do you own Horvath anywhere? Were you able to look into your crystal ball at all? Did COVID give you any kind of telekinesis, whatever it is, powers to help you see the future?
Not on that. When I looked at your notes, I'm like, who is that? It's not with so many teams. It's interesting. A couple other players that we'll talk about a little bit later that I scratched down that are the same. These players are coming out of the woodwork as one-offs from week to week this year. It seems it's like, wow, like you're like, I did not on my radar at all. And then there they are. And some of them are being consistent. Some of these players are actually, one is Eli Holstein's one that I think I had messaged you on him.
Your boy.
And I did happen to get him in a couple just as a one in the drafts late, deep teams, of course. Building consistency. Some of them are doing it against. It's nice to see, but it makes it difficult on us fantasy players. Trying to find the right players to start and sit.
Sure. Absolutely. Blake Horvath's rostership currently sits at 14% owned across all Fantrax leagues.
Oh.
So he is most likely available on your waivers. He's going to want to be a target for you this week. He's got UAB Air Force up next, 2 games in spots where Horvath can build on what he did against Memphis. He's QB6 in total fantasy points scored on the season. Now, he does have 116 points given the games that he's played. 60 plus points of that was this past week. So you kind of got to take that into account. But if you look at what Horvath has done throughout the season, the game before this versus Temple, 38 fantasy points. So it's not something out of the norm for him to do. He had 15 carries for 122 yards in that game and 3 touchdowns. He has 7 rushing touchdowns in the past 2 games. 7 rushing touchdowns to go along with 5 total passing touchdowns on the season. So he's going to want to be a guy that you're going to want to go in and pick up off waivers if he's on there. The top producing running back was SMU's Brashard Smith. He was a waiver grab of ours after week 1. If you did pick him up, he kind of faltered week 2, had the bye. This week 4, this past week, he dominated 151 all-purpose yards, 4 total touchdowns, 42.1 fantasy points versus TCU. He was the top producing running back. The top producing wide receivers is a name we're going to talk about a little later in our play and fades as well. Devontae Ross out of Troy, 11 receptions, 229 yards, 3 touchdowns, 46.3 fantasy points against Florida A&M. And the top producing tight end, a guy we've talked about quite a bit in this segment. If you use the dual designation, Jack Betch from TCU has that wide receiver tight end designation, 8 receptions, 166 yards, 2 touchdowns, good for 32.6 fantasy points. And if you don't use the dual designation, and Jack Betch is a wide receiver, the top producing tight end, another guy that we're going to see often on this list, Harold Fannin out of Bowling Green, 8 receptions, 145 yards and a touchdown against Texas A&M. The best thing about Harold Fannin's production, Mike, is that he's doing it against good teams. He did it against Penn State, where we kind of would have thought that he might have been a fade based on his opponent. Came out, balled. The opponent wasn't a big deal for him. And then Texas A&M, same thing, 8 for 145 and 124.5 fantasy points. Finished as the top producing tight end across college football, if you don't count Jack Betch. So 3 absolute stud performers that put up big points, Mike.
Yeah.
You got any honorable mentions? Any guys that you want to throw out there that helped you win some of your weeks this week?
Well, usual suspects is what I wrote down for Hampton. Did have a big game, but I mean, there was a lot of points in that game, and he produced. And I have a few shares still of Trey Harris, and Harris produced. Ole Miss seems to be a team. I'm really watching Ole Miss. I have high hopes on. I think this year could be a real productive playoff year with this expansion, that if they can get the right matchups in the playoff and there's more games, if a team like that gets momentum from what they're doing right now, they seem to really be meshing. And Trey has really stepped up he had 11 for 225 and 2. So I had him scratch down that. And then a person just on yards, a player, a wide receiver, Dane Key. I had him. He didn't get the touchdown, but a big day, which means sad for Barron Brown and me. And I don't know, Barron Brown isn't a focus at this point. Doesn't mean he won't be, but I was expecting much more high hopes. But Dane Key stepped up as a major target. So
big. And big shout out to John Mateer. Just anyone that was able to draft him at the end of their drafts or pick him up off of waivers for the low. John Mateer has been producing steady fantasy points for anyone that rosters him. If you're looking at his production, 45.58 fantasy points, 34.3, 32. And then this past week, he put up 50.7. He's got 9 passing TDs, and he's got 5 rushing TDs on the season. If you follow Jared Palmgren, CFF_Jared, listen to Chasing the Natty. What you should be doing, I don't know why you're not. He was beating the drum for John Mateer all offseason, and you would have got him for the low, for the cheap. If you were following Jared Palmgren, which you should be doing. I mean, he's one of the best at college fantasy football, man. And John Mateer right now, I believe, overall QB1, is that right?
He might be
fantasy
right
points, 162.58 fantasy points at the QB position. The next QB has 137, and he's the overall fantasy points per game leader at the position. So John Mateer, not a household name for college fantasy football players at the beginning of the season, but is now the overall QB1 for a guy that either went undrafted or was picked up off waivers for you to start the year. Mike?
Yeah, great quarterback. My issue, I was fortunate enough to have a few shares with him, and I still for some reason not enough faith that he would keep repeating it and would play him on one team and sit him on one team to offset. So I'm here to say, don't do that. So that's a mistake of don't do that. Like when you see, just go all in, put the chips in when you have them on your team and go. Don't. I tried to balance it off, and I caught myself. Cost me probably a week in one league, won me a week in one.
Gotcha.
Just go with it.
Yeah. Some other waiver pickups for week 5. Braden Sloan from Ball State, and he's involved in both facets of the game. He's rostered in 33% of leagues. Currently top 30 at the position in fantasy points per game. He has one bye with a decent schedule the rest of the way at wide receiver. Pat Bryant, another week with multiple touchdowns and a good amount of targets. Pat Bryant is wide receiver 12 in fantasy points per game amongst qualifying wide receivers, and he is owned in under 50% of leagues.
Still.
And then a tight end that you might want to be targeting on your waiver wire this week, Tanner Koizal from Ball State, another Ball State target, has seen 7, 8, and 11 targets into 3 games that he's played, and he's owned in under 36% of fantasy football fan tracks, college fantasy football. Had to fit in all the keywords there, Mike.
Well, just to keep me awake from all of this, like congestion.
All right, we got a spotlight game of the week: South Alabama versus LSU. The QBs in this matchup, a stud QB fantasy producing, another one that you probably got for the low. Gio Lopez out of South Alabama. Currently the QB5 in fantasy points per game. He's putting up 32.94 fantasy points per week. And across the field from him is Garrett Nussmeier, QB22 in fantasy points per game. And that's no slouch. I believe he's sitting at 25 fantasy points per game. In the college landscape, QB25 isn't a bad thing, man. QB25 isn't a bad thing. That QB25 still able to put up some pretty good points. At the RB position, true freshman Demorion Fluff Bothwell for South Alabama. RB28 over the season so far. He scored a touchdown in every game. But over the last 2 weeks, he's emerged as a stud. 24 fantasy points per game. That's good enough for a top 10 position, the running back position over the last 2 weeks. And then across from him, he's got Caden Durham, the true freshman out of LSU. It's really a committee room. Josh Williams, and college fantasy football bust Caleb Jackson out of LSU. Mike, do you own any Fluff Bothwell? If only there was someone who would have told you about him early in the year.
Oh, there was somebody who told me about him a week. I waited a week. There was waivers I got caught. I can't blame not feeling that well on trying to jump on waivers. But I went in, and then I realized somebody named at FF Chris happened to scoop 3 shares of him the night before.
Yeah.
And I'm like, so it allowed you to go 24 hours later. Sometimes it's a good strategy. Wait and see when you only have so many pickups. But if it's unlimited pickups, you better better
Sometimes
get in
you
there.
lose,
Sometimes
Mike.
you lose.
Sometimes you
So
lose when you wait. Snooze, you lose.
The story about that, I didn't play him in the one league that I would have played him. I'm not 100% sure I would have won or not if I would have played him. But last minute, I sat him and went with somebody different. So I learned again.
Put fluff in, Mike.
But I know. I mean, for the name alone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The wide receivers in this game, Aaron Anderson for LSU, who's outscored Kyron Lacy over the last 2 weeks, although Lacy has been the more consistent producer for South Alabama. It's Jamal Pritchett. He's been a steady producer. He's averaging 15 fantasy points per game. He scored 30 in that week 1 matchup, but has put up at least 15 in every outing since. So a lot of fantasy points projected in this matchup. The over-under right now is currently set at 65.5, with LSU being favored by 20. So a lot of points projected to be scored. Vegas is currently projecting LSU to score the bulk of them, but do not sleep on South Alabama.
Yeah.
That offense has been able to put up some points against their opponents. And LSU this year has been susceptible to other teams putting points up on them. So I'm expecting a big game for both teams when it comes to fantasy production. So South Alabama versus LSU is our fantasy game of the week. All right, Mike, are you ready to get into these positional plays and fades?
It's getting harder and harder, Chris, to do this.
Hey, we're getting into
I'm like,
play
with our rules that the people need to recap why this is so difficult. And then I go, have I picked this player already? Have I picked this player? I don't know. And then I got to look back. Don't pick in the top 35. Do pick in the 55. Don't, Chris. Me and math. Come on. So
mathematician, you're leading us off with the week 5 QB play. So the frame is yours, brother.
Yeah, I couldn't remember. I think we've talked about Curtis Rourke a little bit, but I don't think we've put them on one of our lists yet, unless he happened to be a fade early. I couldn't recall. But he's making a believer out of me now for a few reasons. I wish Indiana has a top 5, I think, defense. But so they're giving lots of opportunities for Curtis Rourke running the offense for Indiana. And he's only 31% rostered, which is pretty low. You should be rostering him now. He's running. He seems to be getting more and more efficient. And the numbers why I would choose to pick him up, you want to hit his boom when it's going to happen, if it's going to happen. So we hope that there'll be a few boom weeks. You want to get that now. And he doesn't turn the ball over. He hasn't thrown a pick. So if he can continue with doing this in a high 75% completion percentage, so some of the numbers are good, and they're meshing well in Indiana on both sides of the ball. They're staying consistent so far. So it's one of those to take advantage of. Several receivers in the receiving corps, some big receivers, Surratt, Price, Williams, Cross. They're all roughly getting their cookies and it's being shared, and he's running that offense well. So there's a lot of pluses. It's just we're hoping that we get him now, pick him up, let him catch him on the boom week if you're having bye week trouble. So I scratched down. Bye weeks are becoming a bit when I was looking at different schedules for players.
Sure,
they're on,
absolutely.
They play 2, they're off again. It's like, So if he's that lowly rostered, I just take him, and throwing no picks. So if he can take care of the ball, he might be a decent one to pick up this week when I was looking at the matchups.
He's got Maryland this week, which is a great matchup for Curtis Rourke. If you're looking for that spot matchup, Then he's got Northwestern after that, which is another potential decent matchup for Indiana. Northwestern does have a potentially good defense. They're always going to come out to play. They got the bye. And then the rest of the way, though, they've really only got one game where I want to start Curtis Rourke. They do have the playoff bye that first week of the playoffs. Then they go in, they play Ohio State, Purdue. The Purdue matchup might be the one where you want to play championship weekend, but championship weekend, I don't know if you want to put your eggs in the Curtis Rourke basket. Other than Maryland and Northwestern, he's got that game versus Washington, which is going to be enticing for me to where I want to start Curtis Rourke. But you're absolutely right. As a fantasy player, Curtis Rourke isn't a player where you're going to want to lean on him week in and week out. He is great at protecting the ball. He's not going to put his team into position where he's putting the defense with their backs up against the wall. And you're going to want to play him in projected good matchups. And this matchup against Maryland this week is just that. We know Maryland can put up points with Billy Edwards there under center. Right. And we know that Indiana can just do the exact same thing. So I like to play with Curtis Rourke. I started him this past week against Charlotte, and he was pretty good. He put up some decent points for me. I didn't get the win in the leagues where I did put him up, but he didn't cause me to lose like some other quarterbacks did this past week. So great call, Rourke. I like that one. All right. Over QB fade, and this was a tough one this week. There was a lot of matchups with guys ranked in the top 35. I'm trying to pick guys in the top 35 here that we don't want to play. And this week there was some matchups with those guys that were all pretty lucrative. But if I had to pick one guy that I maybe not fully a sit, but just a fade this week, it's Jalen Milroe out of Alabama. He's going up against Georgia. And that's strictly what it is. It's a matchup-based fade. I think he'll have a decent output because of how much he does use his legs. I just don't see him having a top 24, top 25 finish. Opponents versus the Bulldogs have only averaged 91 passing yards per game. Outside of Tennessee Tech, they have faced Cade Klubnik, who is averaging 243 yards passing per game, and Brock Vandegrift, who is averaging 137 yards per game out of Kentucky. Again, let me tell you that it does come with some hesitation with Jalen Milroe. It's not a full sit. If you don't have better options at your disposal, you're going to want to plug in Jalen Milroe because of the potential to produce fantasy points with his legs. Vandegrift averaged 6.8 yards per carry on 10 carries in that game against Georgia. So they are susceptible to letting up big runs to the position. Last year, Jalen Milroe put up 18 fantasy points, threw for two touchdowns and just under 200 yards against Georgia with no rushing touchdowns. QBs are averaging 5.57 fantasy points per game against the Bulldogs. So it's not great. The over-under right now is set to 48.5 with UGA being the early 2.5 favorite. So not a lot of points expected to be scored in this matchup. And that is the reason why I am fading Jalen Milroe. With the amount of points that fantasy producing quarterbacks have the potential to put up on a weekly basis, we know Jalen Milroe can use his legs, but there are other options out there that I'm just going to want to consider over Milroe this week against Georgia, Mike.
Yeah, agree. I would probably sit a lot of players as we go through their rosters. You'd want to fade a lot in that matchup, as sad as that is for us. But when you have all those other options where you can try to find the games with more scoring, lean to those games, because I think a lot of players, I picked a player in that game too as a fade. I think both offenses will try to use as many personnel as they can on the other team because that's what it takes to beat their opposition. Yeah. So, bam, they're not just going to be, here's my go-to guy, I'm throwing it 15 times to him, and we're going to win. That's just not how it works when Georgia and Alabama line up.
Yeah,
outside
exactly.
like
He's really going to need Ryan Williams to come out and have one of those
Oh,
big games where he stretches the field
yeah.
2 times for 125 yards and 2
yeah.
touchdowns, right? So are they going to be able to have those big plays out of the wide receivers? I doubt it against the Georgia defense. It is possible, but I highly doubt it. So the fade comes from, is he going to have the output through the air to be married to the output that he's going to have on the ground that will produce a high volume of fantasy points? And that's where I think he's going to struggle. So he could have double-digit rush attempts only because Alabama's rush offense isn't the greatest this season, and Jalen Milroe could be using that aspect very heavily against Georgia. Because we have seen Brock Vandagriff have a decent day using his legs for Kentucky, they might take a page out of that book and kind of force Jalen Milroe to use his legs Alabama. So there's potential there where Jalen Milroe has a down week against a stud opponent in Georgia. So week 5 QB play, Curtis Rourke out of Indiana. Week 5 QB fade, Jalen Milroe out of Alabama. Bam, baby. Bam. All right. RB play and fade for week 5, Mike. My RB play this week is Ahmad Hardy from ULM going against Troy. A waiver ad after his start. Hardy hasn't been the guy over the last couple, but he has faced Texas and UAB, and his average has dropped down a little bit because of the 2 output days that he had against those 2 teams. But this week, Mike, Ahmad Hardy gets Troy, who outside of Florida A&M this past weekend have seen Caleb Johnson from Iowa go off for 173 yards. Mario Anderson from Memphis ripped for 125 yards on 17 carries. That's good for over 7 yards per carry. And in week 1, saw Savion Red average 12.9 yards per carry on 10 totes. He rushed the ball for over 129 yards that game. Opposing teams are averaging 5.5 yards per carry. And if you take out the outlier, that Florida A&M game, which they played this past week, where Florida A&M only averaged 2.2 yards per carry, opposing capable offenses are averaging 6.8 yards per carry against Troy. He's a bruiser, Mike. He's top 20 in missed tackles forced, according to PFF. And he's done that with a significant lesser role than the people around him. These guys only carried the ball for just over 40 times. The guys around him in that missed tackle force category have all carried the ball for 60, 65, 101, 70. So what he's able to do with a limited amount of carries, a limited amount of touches, where he's able to make fantasy points by breaking tackles is why you want to start Ahmad Hardy. Even more so against Troy. 46 points is the over-under in this game, with Troy being a TD favorite. If ULM puts up any kind of points, which they should at least put up some kind of points this week, it'll come from the legs of Ahmad Hardy, because let's face it, their passing attack is non-existent. General Booty only has 1 game of 3 so far with over 100 passing yards and 1 passing touchdown. So he is what his name says he is. He's generally booty at the position, Mike. So Ahmad Hardy is my running back play for week 5. I dug a little deep for that one. Mike, who is your running back fade?
Yeah, I know we seem to be picking on Alabama, but we both zeroed in on that game. It's interesting going through this process. That's what you have to do. Look for the matchups. Which 2 of the better defenses are going to face one another, both top 15. Same in both categories, what they're doing. I like Jam Miller as a player, but the numbers as I was looking at them are quite even for Haynes and Miller. He is getting 1 touchdown per game, it seems. Jam, which that's good. But it's kind of for the similar reason you said with Milroe. It's not enough. Like 70 yards last game and 9 carries, and that's not enough when we're going to have these different players that are getting multiple touchdowns. and running roughshod over certain teams. So it's another one of those cases. You can have good quality players on the opposing team, like Dominic Lovett. We all love him as a receiver, but yet he's not finding his way into fantasy as being a difference in fantasy. Will Jam Miller? I'm not sure. So this week and beyond, so I've kind of changed my tune as this year's unfolding with him playing, and especially this week against Georgia. I'd like to see more, out of that. I do think he'll still be short line player that they might get, but if Milroe is also getting his chances for a score, that's just eating away at what Jam could be if he's your short yardage. So he's even got to split time in both different strategies, how Alabama runs their offense.
Yeah.
So I'm like, well, it's too bad, because we know both of the backs are good, and it doesn't look like either one. They're another scenario that are going to take the reins and be bell cow. That's just not going to happen when you have a part-time bell cow quarterback as well. So those are the different stats. 9 for 71, 1 TD last week. He's having a decent year. And that's fine. Good player, but maybe in fantasy we find some of these diamonds in the rough that you're finding for us. And you got to go with them. And even like a Fluff Bothwell, who's now 150 yards, 2 TDs, like that's far above and beyond. Will someone on Alabama do this later? Maybe. That's why you should roster them. Yes.
Yeah.
Just as we were saying with rookie,
still a good offense.
Yes. And you need to be rostering them, and you need to be being specific with a matchup if you have to use them. But if you don't have to, I would hesitate, and I'd put in some of these other guys that you're coming up with, Chris. You're giving me good choices here again this week. I better listen.
Yeah, I just gotta watch, because when we play each other, I gotta watch, because maybe that's why he didn't show up last week, because we were playing each other in a couple leagues. He didn't want to give me too much information. I get it now. Blame it on the Coco. Huh? Blame it on the Coco. All right, let's get to the wide receivers, Mike.
Yeah.
RB play Ahmad Hardy from the University of Louisiana Monroe Warhawks. And our fade is Jamorion Jam Miller out of Tuscaloosa going up against Georgia in week 5. Let's jump into our wide receivers. Mike, you got a good one for us to start this week.
Yeah, I put this in here. I'm scolding myself again from a week ago, because I went to grab this particular receiver on waivers, and then I decided, I'll wait another week. That was an error. Like, what am I doing? It must be the ibuprofen meds or something reacting in my airwaves. Like, you know me for the tendencies. Usually I'll get in and you'll get on that. Don't hesitate. I did. And Isaiah Nair is the receiver for Nebraska, because watching the chemistry develop between Dylan Raiola,
he's the guy,
and him, they do have Banks there too, and he's pretty good. And Fedoni is like, there's some nice pieces. A good up and coming team, but 6'4", 220. I started looking up the stats on there, and I'm like, he can become, and he is becoming that go-to receiver, the alpha receiver. So I like his average, 22 yards average per catch. Wow. Like, if you can stretch the field for Dylan, and good arm and good quarterback, who I know they're comparing him to the guy named Mahomes, but I mean, they keep talking about this, but I'll tell you, he's headed in the right trajectory. So I like 16. He has 16 catches, 277 yards, 4 touchdowns last week too. So one strategy, whether it has worked, with Bryant and a few other players, each of us have hit on some pickups this year already that we should have picked up on and played them. So what we need to learn is trust those pickups, as you've been saying, and play them. Don't pick them up and then wait. So I've even did that. I have to scold myself on that and jump on it so you can take advantage. He's 29% rostered. 29.
Yeah.
He shouldn't be 29. So we need, you got a roster and 18% start rate. Like, so the time is now with a few of these guys. I think they can make a league winner if you actually make the move and play them, Mike. That's
the tricky part, though. That's why we're here to help you out, to make sure you know when to play Isaiah Nair and when you should sit. Yeah. But yeah, great play from Nebraska that week 1 where he put up over 120 yards. He had the touchdown as well. Of course, against Colorado, he struggled a bit, but that was going to be expected with, who Colorado has at DB. Of course, they're going to lock up their best wide receiver. And then the week after that, he goes out and against Northern Iowa, puts up a touchdown, 35 yards on 3 targets. And then against Illinois, 7 targets, 90 yards, 4 catches and 2 tugs. So definitely a part of that Nebraska offense. And I like what they got going on. Who does Nebraska got this week, Mike? Do you know?
Oh, where am I on my notes?
Nebraska's got Purdue. They're 4-point favorites. I like the matchup. Then they got Rutgers. The bye week, Indiana, Ohio State, and UCLA. Decent playoff schedule as well. USC, Wisconsin, and Iowa.
Right. Oh, and what I like about that, if they can develop a lot of those teams, decent defenses. So when I looked at it, they're all, decent and high. But if the game plan, how Nebraska wants to run things, they may not have to adjust those game plans too much when if they can get into a groove, as I said earlier. So I'm trying to focus on a few players that giving them a chance to get in their grooves now, because the time's now, as we say, entering week 5. And if you can play some consistent teams with those numbers and you don't have to make too many adjustments with your play calling, hopefully things will click and away they go. Yeah. As opposed to then running into Georgia or running in like somebody top 5 that's going to hit you like a brick wall. Yeah.
Yeah, agreed. All right. Wide receiver fade for week 5 of the college fantasy football season. This is One Foot Down, a college fantasy football podcast on the Fantasy and Frames Network. Make sure you like the stream, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell to get notified whenever Fantasy and Frames drops new content. And around here, that's on a daily basis, baby. We got things cooking up across the board on every day that ends in a Y, baby, because that's what we do here at Fantasy and Frames. We are just whipping up the content. We got the Waiver Show, Fantasy Football Weekly, 4th and Frames, Shoot the Gap, Dynasty 365. We got the show on Sunday to help you get ready for the NFL week. You hop in there, ask your start-sit questions. There's a bunch of pros in there ready to get you ready for the fantasy week. So the wide receiver play is Isaiah Nair from Nebraska. The fade, top producing wide receiver in week 4 is a fade for me in week 5. Devontae Ross going up against ULM. Opposite of my Ahmad Hardy play for this game, Devontae Ross is a fade in this game only. But you're going to say, Chris, Texas just put up 51 points against ULM. He's got to be a play. We got to plug him in. But if you look at the 51 points scored by Texas, only one score came from a wide receiver in Isaiah Bond, and he only put up 75 yards. Texas put up a reception percentage rate of 53. No receiver put up over 100 yards in that game. Like I mentioned, Bond was the closest with 75 in week 2 against UAB. Again, the Warhawks held their wide receiver core down. No wide receiver in that game went for over 50 yards, and there was no receiving touchdowns out of the room. Week 1 against Jackson State, the wide receivers found a bit more success, but even then, their highest output wide receiver only put up 83 yards. The Warhawks are top 50 rated, coverage graded team on Pro Football Focus, PFF. And as good as Ross has been this year, I am not starting him against ULM because of how good their pass coverage has been against teams like Texas, like UAB, teams that can pass the ball around the yard. So for me, he's going to need a touchdown or two to warrant a decent day. And I just don't see that happening for Devontae Ross this week. So that is why for me, he is not a complete sit. Again, if you got no better options,
that's right.
He has the opportunity to put up points because of his role on the Troy offense. But if you have a better option, or if you pick up a better option, or maybe you want to play Isaiah Nayer this week, you might want to play Isaiah Nayer over Devontae Ross, who's going up against ULM. The Warhawks have been pretty good defensively, Mike.
Nope. Yeah,
pretty good.
There's been a few teams playing decent.
They've been decent
defense that are not in the upper echelon, holding them in games. Some.
Yep.
Others.
Not so much.
Not so much. But yeah, there have been a few surprises.
There really has been. And one of them, my week 5 play at tight end. He's been on this list for me already, and that's Bauer Sharp out of Oklahoma. And it really just comes down to, I think he's going to find the end zone against Auburn because of how he's used on the Oklahoma offense. He's second in targets for the Sooners from the start of the season, only behind Deion Burks. And it's that usage that is enticing to me. He's relied upon heavily in closer games and against better defenses. And Auburn is just that. Another great part about Bauer Sharp's game, another reason why he's a play for me, is his slot usage. His slot usage is very promising for the tight end. He has a total slot snaps of 68, which puts him in the top 10 of all tight ends across the FBS. 51% of his snaps come lining up in the slot formation. So he's getting involved in the passing game for Oklahoma. He's top 10 in snaps where he is running a receiving route, top 7 in snaps where he is lined up in pass reps. This all according to PFF. So Oklahoma's putting him in a position to be a part of the pass game. And if you look at what his output was across the season so far, it has shown. Week 1, he was outpaced by Deion Burks by only 1 target. And he finished as the second targeted pass catcher for Oklahoma in that week. Week 2, he was non-existent, but their matchup wasn't the greatest. So he only had 2 targets in that one. He was at the bottom of the list when it came to Oklahoma. Week 3, he was second on the call sheet again in targets. So again, being that second guy in line for Oklahoma in the pass game is what you want out of a tight end, being the second or first option for their respective teams. And then this past weekend against the Tennessee Volunteers, he was the number 1 option for Jackson Arnold, where he finished as the top targeted receiver for Oklahoma. So I'm expecting the same output for Bauer Sharp this week. I'm expecting him to be either the first or second targeted player for the Sooners, and I'm projecting him to score a touchdown because he's heavily involved in their passing game when they get down into the red zone, and there's no reason why he shouldn't be again involved in that aspect of their game when they get down there against Auburn. So that's why Bauer Sharp for me, Mike, is a play this week.
Yeah, I mean, I like my one question to say Anderson is still a question with his injury, and that's a bummer. I own a number of shares. I thought he would get in the lineup to make a difference sooner or later, but then he kind of hobbled again. I don't think it's like a season-ending thing, but with him out, somebody like this gets an opportunity, right?
Farouk is out as well. Farouk was a big part of their offense. Anderson out, Nick Anderson out. So there's potential there. Deion Burks got a little banged up the last game against Tennessee as well. So there's potential there for Bauer Sharp to have a decent day for tight ends. I doubt he finishes as the overall tight end 1, but he has the potential to finish as the top 10 guy. So that's what I'm projecting here for Bauer Sharp.
Are we worried at all about the QB position there as to what they're going to do, and they're going to start going back and forth? I hope they don't.
I hope they don't. I hope they stick with Jackson Arnold. But
a couple different teams are doing that. I'm trying to think offhand. I should have scratched down some notes. There's 2 or 3 different teams now that are almost totally doing what we said at the start of the year, typically that they'll do. And they're almost at a 50-50 split. And that can make it tough. And some of the offenses are pretty good that these teams are doing that. And it's like, wow.
Agreed.
So there we go. But I mean, what are we going to do? We'll go pick Gio Lopez and Mateer.
just that easy, baby. It's
Just that easy. Just
all right, Mike. Who's the fade? Give us the fade for week 5.
the fade.
Tight end
One
position.
we both like this tight end prior to the season, Jack Velling, who went to Michigan State. So I just wanted to repeat that a list of 3 different tight ends came to mind. We've already went through a few of those tight ends that we thought would be really high end tight ends this year that we could count on to help us win leagues, and they're not doing that. So this is another one after Amari Neblack we talked about. Can't remember, we had somebody else we were talking about too, Chris, that we thought they would help lead us to championships, and we've had to replace them with other people that have rose to the top. I know Aiden Chili's there. He still might not be where he needs to be at, but we thought this would be a safety outlet. Quality player like Velling in that offense when you don't have really that alpha number 1 receiver. He has 12 catches, 159 yards, no touchdowns, 13-yard average is okay. But I just think the running game they're leaning on a bit in Michigan State as weather starts happening. If there's home games in Michigan and you have Carter and Lynch Adams, and if Chili's can't get it together, you start reading the tea leaves a little bit as to how they're going to run that offense a little bit. And I don't see it as something that now will jump suddenly and they're going to start throwing the ball all over the yard unless you really have to, like really have to. But some of these programs will kind of go with the tried and true stuff. I think they're going to be more of a running offense. Talented player like Velling, because he's rated by a lot of high significant writers, ESPN, etc. Like that top 10, he was commonplace in that top 10. So it's been a bummer to put him on there, but I think you got to go with other options when we see guys like Fannin and everybody that you say that are almost weekly putting up, and Jack Becker, like those dual threat, dual position players. To go with them. So I'd fade him, even though I like the player. Seems to be a common theme. Like we like a lot of these players that are good players, but we need the numbers.
The production just hasn't been there for him this year. He doesn't have that connection that he had with DJU last season. I mean, this past week was his biggest output in terms of being part of the offense. 10 targets, 6 receptions, 77 yards against Boston College. But before that, it was 3 targets, 4 targets, 3 targets, 15 yards, 25 yards, 42 yards. So not a big part of the game early on for Michigan State. If he can get involved like he was involved in week 4 against Boston College, maybe you hold on to Velling with the hopes that he returns to form, or Michigan State uses him primarily as either the first or second target in that offense. So
that's right.
We know what he's capable of. We've seen it last season. We just need to see it reproduce this season at Michigan State. And as of right now, it just hasn't happened, man. Just hasn't happened. All right, let's recap what we got. Quarterback play of the week, Curtis Rorick. Quarterback fade, Jalen Milroe going up against Georgia. Running back play of the week, Ahmad Hardy versus Troy. Sit is, do you remember, Mike? To your guy. Who the sit is? Jam Miller. Out of Alabama. The wide receiver play is Isaiah Nair from Nebraska going up against Purdue. The fade, Devontae Ross going up against the Warhawks. The tight end play, Bauer Sharp versus Auburn. And the tight end fade, Jack Velling versus Ohio State. Mike, before we get out of here, do you have a bold prediction for week 5?
Yeah, I'm going to do this, even though I think the defense is usually typically pretty good. I think Virginia Tech there, Chris, on your schedule at Miami. If memory serves me right, is it the Hokies and the Hurricanes?
I got the Hurricanes. Man, Cameron Ward's been so good this year, man.
500 yards.
Hurricanes against the Hokies.
Yeah, I'm correct. Okay, so I scratched. I'm going to say he's, instead of 405 yards, he's throwing for 505 yards on the Hokies. Spreading it all over, and he's throwing 4 TDs yet again. On his way to, I'm not going to say the Heisman winner as they're touting him, but he is booking his way into the 3 on the panel for the Heisman. And he's throwing for over 500 against the Hokies and getting her done on a roll.
Yeah, I mean, no game under 300 yards for Cameron Ward this year. No game under 3 passing TDs for Cameron Ward this year. He's played Florida, Florida A&M, Ball State, and South Florida. So no real killers in terms of top-tier programs. I mean, no disrespect to Florida, but it's just not your year this year. They did come out and have a good game this past week. But Miami came out and just whooped you 41-17 that week 1 matchup, and Cameron Ward put up 385-3 that game. So
I just throw that as offensive. In my defensive stat, I'll give you a second one.
I don't know if saying Cam Ward throwing 500 yards.
Yeah, what you talk is even
bold enough. I don't know if that's bold enough.
Right, so I'm going to pick again.
All right.
I went up 100 yards. I'm going to pick so I'm going to go in the Georgia-Alabama showdown. In the Georgia-Alabama showdown. Are you ready?
Sure.
It's only field goals. There's no touchdowns in that game.
No,
they are going to the well. I didn't look at the weather. It's gonna rain. I'm gonna predict a little fall shower if it's possible. I don't know. And then I'm gonna pick. They're just gonna kick field goals and stuff the line and play in the trenches. And no one's putting up numbers.
Jeez, look at you.
Was that better? That's better.
I mean, for fantasy purposes, it kind of stinks, Mike,
I know, but you wanted
it matches. It goes well with our fades for Alabama. So I kind of don't hate it that much, but fantasy purposes, absolutely stinks. Unless you're playing those kickers, unless you're playing in a fantasy league with those kickers, you're good to go. But Mike, that's the show, brother. I appreciate you coming on. I hope you get well. You seem like you're on the up and up, man. You're getting around the corner. And appreciate you coming on, brother. Appreciate all the listeners. Anyone that's tuned in, drop the like or subscribe to the channel. Listen to us wherever you listen to your podcast, Spotify, Apple, wherever you consume your podcast in audio form. Of course, check us out video form on YouTube. We got some great graphics and everything to go along with the show. For Mike, FF Mike H, I'm Chris. Toodles.